Look up at the New York skyline today, and you are witnessing a masterclass in human ambition. Towers of steel and glass pierce the clouds, standing as deliberate monuments to power, wealth, and engineering perfection. But what if I told you the New York skyscraper wasn't born out of a grand, sweeping master plan? It was, in fact, a complete accident. In 1915, a single building plunged an entire neighborhood of Manhattan into permanent darkness. It was called the Equitable Building. Built on a plot of just under 1 acre, it packed 1.2 million square feet of office space into 40 floors at the time, the largest office building in the world by floor area. It rose straight up from the street with no tapering, no setbacks, no consideration whatsoever for the buildings around it. It cast a 7-acre shadow over the surrounding area. And unlike today's slender skyscrapers, its wide girth meant those shadows took much longer to pass. The city of New York had a choice. Let developers keep building whatever they wanted, however tall they wanted, whenever they wanted, or intervene. They intervened. And what happened next didn't just change New York. It created the modern skyscraper as we know it, and shaped every major city's skyline on Earth. To understand why the skyscraper had to be invented, you have to understand the unique suffocating trap of Manhattan. By the late 1800s, New York was booming at an unprecedented rate. Millions of immigrants were arriving, thousands of businesses were incorporating, and they were all crammed onto a narrow, rocky island. They couldn't build outward. They were completely surrounded by water. The only logical way to expand was up. Before steel frames, tall buildings were built with load-bearing masonry walls, thick stone or brick walls that carried the entire weight of the structure. The problem is that the taller you go, the thicker those walls need to be at the base. Load-bearing masonry needs to get thicker at the base. The taller a building rises, limiting its use on small plots of land. A building with masonry walls tall enough to be a genuine skyscraper would need walls so thick at street level that barely any usable floor space would remain. You'd build a monument, not an office building. Steel frames changed everything. Instead of the walls carrying the load, a skeleton of steel columns and beams carried it, meaning the walls could be thin, largely decorative, and filled with as much glass as the architect wanted. You could build taller, faster, and more efficiently than ever before. The structural constraint that had capped building height for all of human history had effectively been removed. The second invention was more mundane, but arguably just as important: the elevator. Think about what this means. Before elevators, the most valuable floors in any building were the lower ones, because nobody wanted to walk up 6 flights of stairs to reach their office. Upper floors are rented for less. Height was a liability, not an asset. The elevator flipped that completely. Suddenly, the upper floors were desirable, quieter, better views, more light, more prestige. Height became valuable. And the moment height became valuable, every real estate developer in New York started asking the same question: how high can we go? Here's something that's hard to comprehend from a modern perspective. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, there were essentially no rules governing how tall a building in New York could be. No height limits, no restrictions on how much of a city block you could fill, no requirements to leave light or air for neighboring buildings or street-level pedestrians. This was America at the height of the Gilded Age, an era of extraordinary industrial wealth, minimal government regulation, and a deep cultural belief that if you owned a piece of land, you could do whatever you wanted with it. The result in Manhattan was a construction race with no referee and no finish line. On completion in 1915, the 542-foot Equitable Building was the 5th tallest skyscraper in New York, and with 1.25 million square feet of rentable space, it was also the world's largest office building in terms of rentable area. It occupied an entire city block. It rose straight up from every edge of its plot with no tapering, no stepping back, no concession to the buildings around it. The backlash was immediate and overwhelming. Neighboring property owners went to the city. Newspapers ran editorials. Architects and urban planners who had been warning about unregulated development for years finally had the perfect example to point to. The 1916 zoning resolution was the first comprehensive zoning law in the US. It didn't ban skyscrapers. It didn't cap their height, absolutely. What it did was require buildings to step back from the street as they rose, creating what became known as the wedding cake profile. The higher you go, the narrower you get. You can still build as tall as you want, but you have to taper. You have to give the street its light back. Look at the Empire State Building. Look at the Chrysler Building. Look at Rockefeller Center. They all have that distinctive tiered, elegant wedding cake shape. They get gracefully narrower as they reach the sky. For decades, people have assumed that this was purely an artistic choice, the absolute pinnacle of Roaring '20s Art Deco design. But it wasn't. It was a strict legal requirement. The architects weren't trying to be beautiful. They were simply molding their buildings to fit the invisible legal boundaries dictated by the 1916 zoning resolution. Now here's the piece that will genuinely surprise you because it debunks something you've probably been told your whole life. You've likely heard that the reason skyscrapers cluster in lower Manhattan and Midtown, with relatively low buildings in between, is because of the bedrock. The story goes that the bedrock is deep in the middle section of the island, making tall buildings impossible there, while it's shallow in the financial district and Midtown, making skyscrapers easy. Lower Manhattan, in fact, has some of the worst geological conditions on the island. Because the bedrock there is below the waterline, it is covered with wet sand. This required expensive foundation technologies to anchor skyscrapers to the bedrock. The polycentric nature of Manhattan was driven more by demand for skyscrapers in particular neighborhoods rather than the inability of suppliers to provide them in other places. Real estate developers built skyscrapers to be near already established centers of commerce, where transportation was easily accessible and away from slums and manufacturing districts. The gap in the middle of the Manhattan skyline exists not because the geology was wrong, but because the economics were wrong. Nobody needed a skyscraper there. Nobody was paying premium rents there. And New York, then as now, the skyline is ultimately a map of money. History often likes to paint a neat picture of grand visionaries executing perfect master plans to change the world. But the reality is usually far messier, far more chaotic, and far more interesting. New York didn't just sit down one day and decide to invent the skyscraper. Chicago actually built the first true tall building, the home insurance building, a few years prior. But New York perfected the concept, and New York defined what a modern skyline should look like. And it did it entirely by accident. The New York skyline isn't just a collection of tall buildings. It's a towering monument to human ingenuity, born from desperation, thick bureaucracy, and a series of brilliant, beautiful accidents. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe.